thank you to Abby for the invitation to be with all of you today. Again, my name is Liz Chase. I'm a senior student success coach. I work in our Student Academic Success Center here on the Allendale campus, which means I meet with students and I talk to them about learning skills strategies. So we have conversations around time management, study strategies, organization, motivation, goal setting, lots of those non-subject specific skills that we need to be academically successful. A lot of those conversations do entail talking about behavior change and talking about habits. I also supervise a graduate student in our office. I have in the past supervised interns, practicum students, as well as I teach a graduate level course in the College Student Affairs Leadership Master's program. So just sharing a couple different facets of what I do as it pertains to what we're going to talk about today. So I've been asked to chat with all of you about providing and receiving feedback and how it relates to my leadership practice. I want to first put out a couple disclaimers, all right? So this is a very broad topic that is nuanced, that I could probably talk to you about for hours, right? We could talk in so many different ways and take so many different focuses on this topic. So with that being said, we have 20, 30 minutes to chat about it. So the takeaways that I'm going to highlight are just a couple takeaways. It's not an exhaustive overview of feedback, providing and receiving feedback, right? The other thing that I would like to say is, so a little bit of just trying to get us on the same page in terms of terminology. Whenever we think about feedback, oftentimes we're inclined to initially think about like constructive criticism, right? Or like negative feedback. I'm going to be talking about that, but I'm also going to be talking about positive feedback, right? Because I feel that it is critical to have a balance of both, whether you're providing that feedback or receiving that feedback, right? We want to acknowledge and reward behaviors that we know will help us, an individual be successful, as well as provide or share insight into ways that they can maybe improve, adjust, and areas, room for improvement, right? So, okay, so those are kind of my disclaimers. The other thing that I want to put out there is I do want this to be as conversational as possible. I am going to be talking a lot, but if you have a comment, a reaction, a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Same thing goes with those zooming in. I'm assuming Abby will be monitoring that, so please feel free to jump in, and I'm happy to pause and address those things. Cool. Okay, so before we get started, I kind of want to just like gauge the mood in the room when it comes to this topic. So by show of hands, how many of you like receiving feedback? Okay. Physically in the space, it's almost everybody. How many of you dislike receiving feedback? And you can feel both ways, right? That's fine. That's totally fine. So just a couple. How many of you like providing feedback? Okay, a couple. How many of you dislike providing feedback? Interesting. Okay, so I say interesting for those who are with us virtually because it seems like more people dislike providing feedback than providing, which is not what I would have guessed, but many of us like receiving feedback. Okay, this is good for me to know, just to sort of gauge where we're at, how we're feeling about it, and I'm probably going to circle back towards the end on some of that. Okay, so I want to start by telling you a little bit about my story for a couple of reasons. One, I think it provides context for all of you as to how I approach providing and receiving feedback. And the other reason why is because I think it's important and valuable for all of you future professionals to hear about someone else's story, right? And someone else's professional journey. So I grew up in a household of educators. So my mom was an elementary school teacher. My dad was a teacher, principal, superintendent, grandfather, superintendent, administrator, right? So I grew up with hearing lots of discussions around education, the power of educating others, learning, growing, how it's a process, right? Lots of conversations around those topics. At the same time, I was introduced and began my journey with the arts at a very young age. So I started dance when I was 4. I also started acting in theater in elementary school, and I continued with both of those art forms through elementary school, middle school, high school, college. So I went to Michigan State University for my undergraduate degrees. I studied theater, communication, and dance. I then moved to Chicago to pursue acting. So I was there, acted with a couple of different non-equity theater companies, had a plethora of jobs, one of which was working for a dance education company that provided after-school programming. After about 7.5 years of that, I decided to switch paths. Came back to Michigan, came to Grand Valley, got a master's in education through that college student affairs leadership program that I currently teach in. Graduated with my master's, got a job at Grand Valley, and have been working here ever since. So I share these aspects of my story because 2 major influences have impacted the way that I view or think about receiving feedback. We're just going to talk about receiving feedback right now. One of those influences is growing up hearing these conversations around education and learning and growing, and how that is a never-ending process, right? I watched my father go from teacher, principal, superintendent, right? Like continue to grow and improve and move through his career in that way. And so for me, thinking about receiving feedback connects to that process, right? That learning and process never ending and improving yourself. And part of that, again, is receiving feedback, right? The other major influence is my experience with the arts, right? How many of you study some type of art right now, or at least practice some type of art form? Okay, a lot of you. Any theater folks in here? That's okay. We still get that connection. Cool. So those of you who are in the arts, you know that receiving feedback is a big component of that work, right? That's how we perfect our craft, right? That's how we hone our skills, right? We want that feedback. We want those notes from that director. We want those adjustments or edits or whatever you want to call them, right? So again, when I reflect back on these experiences in my life, I was sort of primed from a very young age to used to receiving feedback, right? It's part of the process. I understand if I want to get better at the craft or the work that I do, I need to receive that feedback, right? So those 2 things have been major influences in my life. And how it ties into my leadership practice is that I think that's an incredibly important quality for a leader, is to understand and know your learning and your growing never ends. Just because you step into some type of leadership position doesn't mean that that's your end point, the work's done, right? You can always learn, you can always grow, you can always make improvements, right? So that for me is an important quality as a leader. The other thing that I think is important in terms of receiving feedback is I personally think it's important to look for that feedback from all directions, right? So I'm not just looking to my direct supervisor for feedback, but I'm looking at my colleagues, and I'm in constant conversation with those that I lead as well for feedback. So in my office, we have a bi-weekly coaching team meeting where we're just literally asking each other, okay, I'm working with a student. What would you suggest in what kind of strategies should I use for this situation, right? Or the student said that, how should we approach this situation, right? We're constantly eliciting feedback from each other to better serve students. Same thing with my graduate student. I'm constantly asking her, what are we doing wrong? What's working, right? What ways can we improve our services for students? We're starting a new program next semester, never done it before, have no idea how it's going to land with students. I've asked my graduate student who I supervise to partner with me on that program. And that's just what it is. We're both hashing out the details. Like, what are we going to do with students? How are we going to approach it? How are we going to do this work, right? And the reason why it's important to look for feedback from all directions is because they're going to provide you with a diverse perspective, right? And they're going to see the gaps that you can't see. That's important, okay? The last thing that I would say in terms of receiving feedback and why that's important in my leadership practice is because I would never ask those that I lead to do something that I'm not already doing or willing to do myself. Right? So you got to lead by example. I can't expect others that I lead to receive feedback if I'm not also open to receiving feedback. So I have a couple of stories, tangible examples of when I received feedback. So one sort of indirect feedback that I received, another example is direct feedback. So the first year that I moved to Chicago, went there to act, right? So I'm auditioning, I'm like doing all the things that my undergraduate program taught me to do, sending my headshot resume out to all different theater companies, talent agencies, right? I am like hustling that first year. Never get cast. I get callbacks, which is good. It's like the equivalent of like a second interview, right? Never get cast. So I go home feeling ashamed, feeling embarrassed, have a little breakdown with my mom. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I went to Chicago to do this one thing, and I have not been able to do that one thing this entire year. Instead, I've been serving tables and barely making rent. So I had a choice. It was sort of a fork in the road moment. I could go back home, do something else, or I could go back to Chicago, take that indirect feedback, right? Because it was feedback. They weren't casting me, which told me you have more to learn, right? Not only about your craft, but about this particular theater community here in Chicago. So that's what I did. So the next year, did not audition at all. Instead, I took acting classes from a pretty good theater company at the time there. I interned there, so I was able to make connections with the actors that were within that company. I went out and saw shows, right? Just in observing, like, what was that scene like, making connections with other people at these different theater companies. And then I would say after that was probably like a half a year. Then the next half of that year, I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to get back out there again. Started to get cast, right? So there's always going to be a moment where you have a choice. You can receive that feedback, and as hard and terrible as it feels, right? You can either move forward, take that feedback, do something active about it, or not, right? Other example, when I received pretty direct feedback, feels slightly similar to the last story that I just told you, which is after I graduated with my master's degree, I started interviewing, was getting second interviews, was not getting hired. So I immediately, pretty early on in that process, reached out to a chair of a search committee of an interview that I just had that I thought went really well, because I was like really frustrated. I was like, man, I'm doing all the things, right? So I reached out and I said, hey, just really quickly, when you have a moment, can you just shoot me over some feedback, right? I'm wanting to improve and get better as I go on my job search journey. The individual emailed me back, said, yeah, let's have a phone conversation. I was like, okay. I mean, I just was expecting like a couple quick comments in an email. So they took time to have a phone conversation with me. They gave me really, really good feedback. They were like, yeah, you're not using specific examples. You need to tell more stories. Totally, right? And they also gave me a really good piece of feedback that I actually currently use now whenever I'm talking to future grads that are about to go on their job search, which is whenever you get stuck with a question, circle back to your value statements, right? Because that's a really, really good way for an interviewer to get a sense of who you are, what you value in your work, right? And that's like a really easy thing for you to sort of like recall in the moment when you get a little flustered. So I was like, okay, this is good. So went on with my job search, implemented those changes, started getting on-campus interviews, which in our field is like the step before they hire somebody. So it's a good thing, right? So in that example, you can't wait for the feedback to come to you sometimes, right? You have to actively seek it out if you want to improve, get better, hone your skills.